April 18, 1942. The sacred homeland of Japan had never been touched by enemy bombs. For centuries, no foreign military force had successfully attacked Japanese soil. The emperor was considered divine, untouchable, protected by an invisible shield of destiny and honor. But at 12:15 p.m. on that spring afternoon, 16 American B-25 Mitchell bombers materialized over Tokyo like vengeful spirits. As the first explosions echoed through the capital, Japanese General Hideaki Matsumura stood frozen on his command balcony, watching his world crumble. What he witnessed that day would shatter everything the Japanese military believed about their invincibility. This is the story of how 80 American airmen accomplished the impossible and left an entire empire in disbelief.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of April 18th began like any other in Tokyo. Cherry blossoms danced on gentle spring breezes while citizens hurried through their daily routines, completely unaware that their lives were about to change forever. At the Imperial Japanese Army headquarters, General Hideaki Matsumura reviewed routine intelligence reports over his morning tea. The reports were reassuring. American forces remained thousands of miles away in the Pacific, licking their wounds after Pearl Harbor. The homeland was secure, protected by an impenetrable ring of naval patrols and early warning systems. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell had been planning this moment for months. Standing on the rain-soaked deck of the USS Wasp, he watched his 16 B-25 bombers being prepared for what everyone knew was a suicide mission. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. The bombers would launch from a distance never before attempted, fly over 650 miles of hostile Pacific Ocean, strike their targets in broad daylight, then attempt to reach airfields in China if they had any fuel remaining. Mitchell's crew chief, Sergeant Robert Anderson from Kansas, double-checked the fuel calculations for the third time. Every gallon mattered. They had stripped everything non-essential from the aircraft: armor plating, defensive guns, even the radio equipment. In their place, they loaded extra fuel tanks and 500-pound bombs. Each bomber carried just enough ammunition for a brief firefight and prayers that they wouldn't need it. The weather that morning was deteriorating rapidly. Captain William Henderson, the mission's navigation specialist from Oregon, studied the meteorological reports with growing concern. Storm systems were moving across their intended flight path, creating dangerous crosswinds that could scatter the formation. But Admiral Theodore Patterson had already committed the task force. There would be no delays, no second chances. At 8:20 a.m., the first bomber lifted off from the Wasp's pitching deck. Mitchell watched from the bridge as Lieutenant Commander Charles Brooks from Texas fought to keep his heavily loaded aircraft airborne. The bomber wallowed through the air, barely maintaining altitude as it disappeared into the gray morning haze. One by one, the remaining 15 aircraft followed, each departure a small miracle of engineering and courage. Back in Tokyo, the morning air raid sirens had fallen silent. These drills had become routine, almost ceremonial. Citizens barely looked up anymore when the wardens tested the warning systems. General Matsumura dismissed the latest drill report without reading it. His attention was focused on operational plans for expanding Japanese control in Southeast Asia. The concept of enemy aircraft over Tokyo was so inconceivable that the military had grown complacent about homeland defense. Flight Lieutenant David Coleman from Michigan was piloting the lead bomber, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Japanese patrol aircraft. The Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast blue desert broken only by occasional whitecaps.
His bombardier, Sergeant Michael Thompson from Ohio, studied reconnaissance photographs of their target, the Nakajima aircraft factory on the outskirts of Tokyo. Intelligence reports indicated the facility was producing engines for Zero fighters at maximum capacity. The radio silence was absolute. No communication between aircraft, no contact with the carrier task force. They were completely alone, flying toward the most heavily defended airspace in the Pacific. Coleman checked his fuel gauge every few minutes, watching the needle creep steadily downward. Mathematical precision would determine whether they lived or died. At 11:45 a.m. Tokyo time, the first Japanese radar station detected unidentified aircraft approaching from the east. Operator Petty Officer Yamamoto initially dismissed the contacts as false readings, weather interference, or perhaps a flock of migrating birds. The signals were too distant, too impossible to be enemy aircraft. He noted the contacts in his log, but didn't sound an alert. General Matsumura was reviewing casualty reports from Guadalcanal when his aide burst into the office. The young officer's face was pale, his normally perfect uniform disheveled. Enemy aircraft had been spotted approaching the capital, he stammered. Matsumura set down his teacup with deliberate calm. This was obviously another false alarm, another nervous radar operator jumping at shadows. But then the telephone rang. Commander Paul Richards from California was flying the third bomber in formation when he spotted the Japanese coastline rising from the Pacific haze. The sight should have been beautiful, green hills dotted with traditional villages, fishing boats scattered across sheltered bays. Instead, it represented the most dangerous moment of their lives. Every mile inland increased their chances of being intercepted by Zero fighters. The anti-aircraft batteries around Tokyo Bay were completely unprepared. Gunners lounged in the spring sunshine, playing cards and sharing stories. When the air raid sirens finally began wailing at 12:10 p.m., most assumed it was another drill. Some didn't even bother to man their positions until they heard the distant roar of aircraft engines growing louder. Lieutenant Thomas Walsh from New York was piloting the bomber assigned to strike the Imperial Palace district. His orders were specific: avoid the Emperor's residence itself, but hit military targets in the surrounding area. As Tokyo's skyline appeared through the haze, Walsh felt a moment of surreal disbelief. They had actually made it. 16 bombers from a carrier task force had penetrated the heart of the Japanese Empire. General Matsumura reached his command balcony just as the first bombs began falling. The Nakajima factory erupted in orange flames and black smoke. A second explosion rocked the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries complex. Then a third blast shattered windows across the Kanda district. The impossible was happening. American bombers were attacking the sacred homeland. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. For 6 months, Japanese propaganda had assured the population that the homeland was invulnerable, that American forces lacked the courage and capability to threaten the divine emperor. Citizens stared at the sky in stunned confusion, watching enemy aircraft calmly dropping bombs on their capital city. Sergeant Anderson's bomber targeted the Tokyo Gas and Electric Company facilities in the Eastern District. His 500-pound bombs struck with precision, triggering secondary explosions that sent flames hundreds of feet into the air. Power grids failed across entire neighborhoods. The city's industrial heartbeat stuttered and stopped.
Zero fighters finally scrambled from airfields around the capital, but the American bombers were already departing. The Japanese pilots flew desperate intercept courses, pushing their aircraft to maximum performance. A few managed brief gun runs, but the B-25s maintained formation discipline and mutual defensive fire. Most of the Japanese fighters arrived too late, circling helplessly over smoking ruins. The bombing run lasted exactly 18 minutes. 18 minutes to shatter the myth of Japanese invincibility.
As the last American bomber disappeared toward the western horizon, General Matsumura stood amid the chaos of his command center, trying to comprehend what had just occurred. Radio reports flooded in from across the city, fires burning out of control, civilian casualties, military installations damaged or destroyed. But the most devastating casualty was something intangible yet irreplaceable: the absolute confidence that had defined Japanese military thinking since Pearl Harbor. If 16 enemy bombers could appear over Tokyo without warning, what other impossibilities might become reality? Captain William Henderson had exactly 47 minutes of fuel remaining when the Chinese coastline finally emerged through the afternoon mist. His bomber had been running on mathematical prayers for the past hour, every minute bringing them closer to a forced ocean landing. Behind him, the 16 aircraft of the strike force were scattered across hundreds of miles of hostile airspace, each crew fighting their own desperate battle against time and fuel consumption. In Tokyo, the fires continued to rage. General Matsumura had moved his command post to an underground bunker as smoke from the industrial district darkened the afternoon sky. The casualty reports were devastating, but not in the way he had expected. Only 68 civilians had been killed, far fewer than anticipated. The real damage was psychological. The Japanese military's reputation for invincibility had been shattered in 18 minutes of precision bombing. Emperor Hirohito himself had felt the ground shake beneath the imperial palace. His personal secretary, Maki Kido, described the emperor's reaction as stunned silence, followed by a single question that would haunt Japanese leadership. How is such a thing possible? The divine ruler's safety had been threatened by foreign bombs, an event that challenged the fundamental mythology of Japanese supremacy. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brooks was flying his bomber at treetop level across the Chinese interior, desperately searching for the emergency airfield at Quezon. His fuel gauges showed empty, but the engines continued running on vapors and determination. Navigation was nearly impossible. The landscape below showed no recognizable landmarks, just endless rice paddies and mountain ridges shrouded in evening fog. The Japanese High Command was already implementing emergency measures. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, received word of the Tokyo bombing while aboard his flagship in Truk Lagoon. His first reaction was professional curiosity. How had American bombers achieved such an impossible feat? His second was cold fury. The homeland had been violated, and revenge would be swift and merciless. Flight Lieutenant David Coleman's aircraft was the first to crash land in Chinese territory. His bomber came down in a rice paddy near the village of Tanmushan, sliding through mud and water before coming to rest against a stone wall. The crew emerged shaken but alive, immediately destroying their aircraft's sensitive equipment and classified materials. Local Chinese farmers emerged cautiously from hiding, uncertain whether these were friend or foe. General Claire Lee Chennault, commanding American volunteer forces in China, received the first fragmentary reports. 16 American bombers had somehow materialized over Japan, struck military targets with precision, and were now scattered across occupied Chinese territory. The audacity was breathtaking, but the consequences would be severe for Chinese civilians caught harboring the air crews. Sergeant Robert Anderson's bomber ran out of fuel 50 miles short of the designated landing field. The crew prepared for a controlled crash landing, selecting what appeared to be an empty beach near the coastal city of Taizo. The bomber touched down hard on wet sand, bounced twice, then slid to a stop just yards from a fishing village. Local residents rushed to assist the Americans, despite knowing that Japanese patrols were already searching the area. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Back in Tokyo, intelligence officers were reconstructing the attack with growing amazement. The bombers had approached from a direction considered impossible, directly from the Pacific Ocean at maximum range. No aircraft carrier could have launched such a strike from a safe distance. Yet the evidence was undeniable. 16 twin-engine bombers had appeared over the capital without warning. Captain Paul Richards had managed to reach the emergency airfield at Kweijo, but his landing was catastrophic. The bomber's landing gear collapsed on impact, sending the aircraft skidding across the dirt runway in a shower of sparks. The crew escaped seconds before fuel vapors ignited, destroying their aircraft completely. Chinese Air Force personnel rushed to provide medical assistance and begin immediate evacuation procedures. The human cost of the raid was beginning to emerge on both sides. 3 American aircrewmen had been killed in crash landings, while 5 others were captured by Japanese patrol units. The psychological impact on Japanese military leadership, however, was far more significant than the physical casualties. For the first time since the Meiji Restoration, foreign enemies had successfully attacked the Japanese homeland. Lieutenant Thomas Walsh's crew had bailed out over mountainous terrain near Hangzhou. Their parachutes scattered them across several miles of forest and farmland. Walsh himself landed in a bamboo grove, his parachute tangling in the canopy 30 feet above ground. Chinese resistance fighters found him after a 6-hour search, beginning an elaborate escape network that would spirit the air crews toward safety. General Matsumura was facing the most difficult conversation of his military career. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo had summoned him to explain how American bombers had penetrated Japanese airspace without detection. The general had no satisfactory answers. Radar coverage had proven inadequate, fighter response had been too slow, and anti-aircraft defenses had been caught completely unprepared. The Chinese government immediately began evacuation procedures for areas where American aircrews had been spotted. Japanese retaliation would be swift and brutal, targeting any civilian population suspected of assisting the raiders. Entire villages began moving deeper into the interior, carrying what possessions they could manage and abandoning their ancestral homes. Commander Michael Thompson's bomber had crashed in Japanese-occupied territory near Nanchang. The crew destroyed their aircraft and began a desperate overland escape, moving only at night and hiding during daylight hours. Japanese patrols were already combing the area with dogs and local informants, offering substantial rewards for information about the American airmen. The strategic implications were becoming clear to both sides. Japan's military leadership realized that their homeland defenses required massive reinforcement. Fighter squadrons would be withdrawn from combat zones to protect the sacred islands. Radar networks would be expanded and upgraded. Anti-aircraft batteries would multiply around every major city. Staff Sergeant Kevin Murphy from Minnesota was the last American to reach Chinese territory. His bomber had been damaged by anti-aircraft fire over Tokyo, leaking fuel and losing altitude steadily during the long flight west. The crew managed to crash land in a river valley near Lishui, where Chinese soldiers were already waiting to begin evacuation procedures. The international reaction was immediate and polarizing. American newspapers proclaimed the raid a triumph of courage and ingenuity. Japanese propaganda denounced it as terrorism against civilian targets. British intelligence recognized the psychological value of proving that Japan could be attacked. Soviet observers noted the implications for their own homeland defense planning. General Matsumura spent the evening hours coordinating the massive search operation across occupied China. Hundreds of Japanese troops were being diverted from combat operations to hunt for the American air crews. The irony was bitter. The successful enemy raid was now disrupting Japanese military operations across multiple theaters. As darkness fell across East Asia, the full magnitude of the day's events began to crystallize. 16 American bombers had accomplished something the Japanese military considered impossible, proving that no territory was truly invulnerable in modern warfare. The physical damage to Tokyo would be repaired within weeks, but the psychological impact would influence Japanese strategic thinking for the remainder of the war. The sacred homeland had been touched by enemy fire, and nothing would ever be the same. Dawn broke over the Chinese countryside with an ominous silence. In villages across Zhejiang province, families packed their belongings and prepared to flee as Japanese search columns mobilized across the region. The successful American bombing of Tokyo had triggered a manhunt of unprecedented scale, with over 50,000 Japanese troops diverted from combat operations to pursue 16 scattered air crews. Colonel Takeshi Yamada commanded the 15th Infantry Regiment tasked with capturing the American raiders. His orders were explicit and brutal: find the enemy airmen at any cost, and punish any Chinese civilians who provided assistance. Yamada established his command post in the occupied city of Hangzhou, coordinating search operations across a territory larger than some European nations. Lieutenant Samuel Foster from Georgia had been hiding in a Buddhist monastery for 3 days, cared for by monks who risked torture and death to protect him. The monastery's abbot, an elderly man named Chen Wei, had lived through decades of warfare and understood the consequences of harboring American fugitives. Yet his Buddhist compassion compelled him to offer sanctuary to the wounded airmen. The Japanese retaliation against Chinese civilians began immediately. In the village of Dafeng, where locals had been seen helping American parachutists, Japanese soldiers executed 23 farmers and burned their homes. The message was clear: assisting enemy combatants would result in collective punishment extending to entire communities. Captain James Rodriguez from New Mexico was moving through mountain forests with his navigator, Sergeant Douglas Carter from Alabama. They traveled only at night, guided by Chinese resistance fighters who knew every trail and hiding place in the rugged terrain. The resistance network had been operating since 1937, but harboring American airmen represented their most dangerous mission yet. General Matsumura received hourly updates on the search operations from his Tokyo headquarters. The military's reputation depended on capturing the raiders and demonstrating that attacks on the homeland would be met with overwhelming retaliation. Emperor Hirohito himself had inquired about the progress of the manhunt during his morning briefing. In Washington, D.C., President Franklin Roosevelt was carefully managing the international implications of the raid. While American newspapers celebrated the daring attack, diplomatic channels buzzed with concern about Japanese reprisals against Chinese civilians. Secretary of War Henry Stimson estimated that thousands of innocent people might die in retaliation for the successful bombing mission. Staff Sergeant Andrew Phillips from Connecticut had been captured near the crash site of his bomber. Japanese interrogators subjected him to days of questioning, demanding details about American carrier operations and future attack plans. Phillips provided only his name, rank, and serial number, enduring beatings and psychological torture while protecting classified information.
The Chinese military commander in the region, General Xu Ye, faced an impossible situation. His forces were already fighting a desperate defensive campaign against Japanese occupation armies. Now he was expected to protect scattered American airmen while avoiding provocations that might trigger even more brutal reprisals against civilian populations.
Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, the mission commander, had successfully reached the temporary safety of Chongqing after a harrowing overland journey. His debriefing with American intelligence officers revealed the true scope of what they had accomplished. Not only had they struck military targets in Japan, but they had fundamentally altered enemy strategic planning by forcing homeland defense improvements. The psychological warfare implications were becoming clear to both sides. Tokyo Rose, the English-language propaganda broadcaster, denounced the American raiders as cowardly terrorists who targeted innocent civilians. American radio stations countered by emphasizing the precision strikes against military and industrial facilities, portraying the air crews as heroes of democracy. Captain Benjamin Hayes from Louisiana was hiding in a coal mine near Quiso, protected by Chinese miners who shared their meager rations and medical supplies. The miners understood the risks, but had witnessed enough Japanese atrocities to feel solidarity with any enemy of the occupation forces. Their quiet courage represented the best of human nature under impossible circumstances. Japanese intelligence officers were canalizing wreckage from the crashed bombers, searching for clues about American technological capabilities and strategic intentions. The discovery of long-range fuel tanks confirmed their worst fears. Enemy forces possessed the capability to launch surprise attacks from previously safe distances. The diplomatic consequences rippled across neutral nations. Swiss and Swedish observers noted the escalation in warfare tactics, while German military analysts studied the implications for their own homeland defense strategies. The successful carrier-based bomber attack represented a new paradigm in naval aviation that would influence military planning worldwide. Sergeant Mark Wilson from Iowa was captured while trying to cross the Yangtze River. His Chinese guides had been betrayed by a local informant seeking the substantial reward offered by Japanese authorities. Wilson's capture provided enemy interrogators with their first opportunity to question an American aircrew member about the technical details of the bombing mission. The search operations were disrupting Japanese military effectiveness across multiple fronts. Troops withdrew from Burma and the Solomon Islands to hunt American airmen, weakening defensive positions throughout the Pacific theater. The strategic cost of the manhunt was beginning to exceed the psychological value of capturing the raiders. General Claire Chennault coordinated rescue operations from his headquarters in Kunming, utilizing his network of Chinese contacts and American volunteers. Every successful extraction required elaborate deception operations, forged documents, and bribery of local officials. The human cost was enormous. Dozens of Chinese civilians died for each American airman who reached safety. Flight Sergeant Robert Taylor from Montana spent 2 weeks traveling through Japanese-occupied territory disguised as a Chinese peasant. His rescue team had darkened his skin with walnut stains and provided authentic local clothing. The deception held until a checkpoint guard noticed his Occidental eyes during a routine inspection. The long-term strategic implications were becoming apparent to military planners on both sides. Japan would be forced to maintain substantial homeland defense forces throughout the remainder of the war, reducing their offensive capabilities in other theaters. The psychological impact on Japanese civilian morale was immeasurable. The myth of invulnerable homeland had been permanently shattered. Emperor Hirohito personally reviewed reports of the American airmen's treatment in captivity. The divine ruler's questions about prisoner handling revealed his concern about international opinion and potential war crimes tribunals. The successful enemy attack on sacred Japanese soil had introduced unprecedented complexities into imperial decision-making processes. As April drew to a close, the immediate aftermath of the Doolittle Raid was crystallizing into lasting consequences. 71 of the 80 American aircrewmen had survived their desperate escape attempts. 3 had been killed in crash landings, while 8 remained in Japanese captivity facing uncertain fates. But their 18-minute bombing run had accomplished something far beyond the physical damage to Tokyo's industrial facilities. The impossible had become possible, and the reverberations would echo through the remainder of World War II. 3 months after the raid, the true magnitude of Japanese retaliation became horrifyingly clear. Operation Say Go, the military's systematic punishment campaign across eastern China, had claimed over 250,000 civilian lives. Entire counties had been depopulated, their inhabitants killed or driven into the wilderness. The successful 18-minute bombing of Tokyo had triggered the largest act of genocide in the Pacific War. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Mackenzie from Washington State finally reached Allied lines in Burma after a 2,000-mile journey across occupied territory. His debriefing with General Joseph Stilwell revealed the extraordinary courage of Chinese civilians who had risked everything to help American airmen escape. Mackenzie's detailed reports would later become crucial evidence in war crimes tribunals. In Tokyo, General Matsumura was struggling with the strategic implications of homeland defense. The emperor's military advisors demanded absolute protection against future air attacks, requiring the deployment of 12 fighter squadrons that were desperately needed in the Solomon Islands campaign. The resource allocation decisions were tearing apart Japan's offensive capabilities across the Pacific. The captured American airmen faced a nightmare of interrogation and psychological torture in Japanese prison camps. Captain Benjamin Murphy from Ohio endured 3 weeks of solitary confinement and regular beatings while his captors demanded technical details about American carrier operations. His resistance to interrogation became legendary among fellow prisoners, inspiring them to maintain their own silence under torture. Chinese Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek was facing impossible political pressures from the civilian massacre. His nationalist forces were already engaged in desperate defensive operations against Japanese armies advancing towards Chongqing. The additional burden of protecting American escapees while avoiding provocations that might trigger even more brutal reprisals was stretching his resources beyond the breaking point. Admiral William Bull Halsey received intelligence reports about Japanese fleet movements that revealed the raid's strategic impact. Enemy carrier task forces were being recalled from offensive operations to establish defensive patrols around the home islands. The successful bombing had fundamentally altered Japanese naval strategy, forcing them into a defensive posture that would persist throughout the war.
Flight Sergeant Timothy O'Connor from Massachusetts had spent 4 months hiding in a Catholic mission near Nanjing. The French missionaries who protected him understood the risks but felt morally compelled to assist the American airmen. When Japanese soldiers finally discovered his presence, they executed 6 priests and burned the mission to the ground, but O'Connor had already been spirited away by underground resistance fighters. The propaganda war intensified as both sides attempted to control the narrative of the raid's aftermath. Japanese broadcasts emphasized the cowardly nature of terror bombing against civilian targets, while American media focused on precision strikes against military installations. The truth lay somewhere between these extremes, but public opinion was shaped more by emotional appeals than factual analysis. Colonel Mitchell's technical report to the Army Air Forces contained revolutionary insights about long-range bombing operations. His recommendations for modified fuel systems, improved navigation equipment, and enhanced crew training would influence American strategic bombing doctrine for the remainder of the war. The tactical lessons learned from the Doolittle Raid directly contributed to the success of subsequent B-29 operations against Japanese industrial targets.
Emperor Hirohito's private conferences with his military advisors revealed the deep psychological impact of the homeland attack. Court records, later discovered by occupation forces, showed the divine ruler questioning fundamental assumptions about Japanese invulnerability. His growing doubts about military assurances would eventually contribute to his decision to surrender in 1945. The Chinese civilians who had assisted American airmen continued paying the ultimate price months after the raid. In Anhui province, Japanese units implemented collective punishment policies that resulted in the systematic destruction of 33 towns and villages. Agricultural infrastructure was deliberately targeted to create famine conditions that would persist long after the war's end. Captain Richard Barnes from Nevada successfully evaded capture for 6 months, living with Chinese communist guerrilla units in the mountains of Shaanxi province. His integration into the resistance network provided him with unique insights into Chinese military capabilities and political divisions that would prove valuable to American intelligence services in the post-war period. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan evolved directly from lessons learned during the Doolittle Raid. General Curtis LeMay's subsequent B-29 operations incorporated Mitchell's recommendations for low-level attacks, precision targeting, and coordinated timing. The psychological warfare value of striking the Japanese homeland became a cornerstone of American strategic planning. Japanese home defense preparations consumed increasingly scarce resources as 1942 progressed into 1943. Radar installations, anti-aircraft batteries, and fighter aircraft were concentrated around major cities at the expense of forward combat zones. The successful enemy penetration of sacred airspace had created a defensive mentality that would handicap Japanese offensive operations throughout the Pacific. Staff Sergeant Victor Rodriguez from Arizona was liberated by Chinese nationalist forces after 8 months in Japanese captivity. His physical condition reflected the brutal treatment of American prisoners, but his spirit remained unbroken. His detailed testimony about Japanese interrogation methods and prison conditions would later contribute to war crimes prosecutions during the Tokyo trials. The technological intelligence gathered from crashed American bombers accelerated Japanese research into long-range aviation capabilities. However, their industrial capacity was already stretched beyond sustainable limits by the demands of a multi-theater war. The captured American technology pointed towards capabilities they could never hope to match with their available resources. General Matsumura's career effectively ended with the successful enemy bombing of Tokyo. Despite his competent management of the subsequent search operations, he became the scapegoat for the intelligence failure that allowed American bombers to penetrate Japanese airspace. His reassignment to a minor administrative position in Manchuria reflected the political consequences of military embarrassment. The international diplomatic implications continued reverberating through neutral nations and allied partnerships. Swedish diplomatic reports noted the escalation in strategic bombing doctrine, while Swiss observers documented the humanitarian consequences for Chinese civilian populations. The successful carrier-based bombing attack had established new precedents for international warfare that would influence post-war military planning. As 1942 drew to a close, the full impact of the Doolittle Raid was becoming apparent to military analysts on both sides. The 18-minute bombing run had accomplished far more than its planners ever imagined. Beyond the physical damage to Japanese industrial facilities, it had fundamentally altered the psychological and strategic landscape of the Pacific War.
The impossible mission had proven that no territory was truly safe from determined enemies, and the consequences of that revelation would shape military thinking for generations to come. The summer of 1945 brought Japan to its knees, but the shadow of April 18, 1942 still haunted the corridors of power in Tokyo. As Emperor Hirohito contemplated surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he reflected on the moment when the myth of Japanese invincibility first cracked. The Doolittle Raid had been the opening act in a 3-year campaign of strategic bombing that ultimately brought the Divine Empire to its knees. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, now a full colonel, stood in the ruins of the Nakajima aircraft factory he had bombed 3 years earlier. The facility that once produced engines for Zero fighters was now a twisted landscape of melted steel and concrete. B-29 superfortresses had completed what his 16 B-25s had begun, reducing Japan's industrial capacity to less than 20% of its 1942 levels. The human cost of the raid's aftermath continued to reverberate through Chinese society long after the war's end. Dr. Sarah Chen, a medical researcher at Stanford University, would spend decades documenting the demographic impact of Operation Say Go. Her studies revealed that entire bloodlines had been exterminated in the Japanese retaliation, creating cultural wounds that would take generations to heal. The villages that had sheltered American airmen paid a price that exceeded comprehension. Captain Benjamin Hayes emerged from his wartime experiences as a changed man. The Louisiana native had spent 18 months evading Japanese patrols with the help of Chinese resistance fighters, witnessing firsthand the extraordinary courage of ordinary people under impossible circumstances. After the war, he dedicated his life to documenting the stories of Chinese civilians who had sacrificed everything to help American airmen escape. The technological legacy of the raid extended far beyond its immediate tactical applications. Boeing's development of the B-29 Superfortress incorporated lessons learned from the long-range fuel management techniques pioneered during the Tokyo mission. The navigation challenges faced by Mitchell's crews led to advances in radio beacon technology and celestial navigation systems that would later influence commercial aviation development.
In the decades following the war, Japanese historians struggled to contextualize the Doolittle Raid within their national narrative. Professor Hiroshi Tanaka of Tokyo University spent his career studying the psychological impact of the attack on Japanese strategic thinking. His research revealed that the successful enemy penetration of sacred airspace had fundamentally altered Japanese risk assessment, leading to increasingly defensive military postures that ultimately contributed to their defeat. The survivors of the Chinese resistance networks that had protected American airmen carried their stories into the post-war period with a mixture of pride and trauma. Lu Mingshan, a farmer who had guided 3 American aircrewmen to safety through 200 miles of occupied territory, never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences. His silence reflected the complex legacy of heroism intertwined with devastating consequences for those who had dared to help. Admiral William Halsey's post-war memoirs revealed the strategic deception that had made the raid possible. The careful positioning of the carrier task force, the coordination with Chinese intelligence networks, and the precise timing of the attack had required months of planning that involved hundreds of personnel across multiple branches of the military. The successful execution represented one of the most complex joint operations of the early war period. The captured American airmen who survived Japanese imprisonment became living testimonies to both human resilience and the brutality of total war. Staff Sergeant Andrew Phillips spent 40 months in solitary confinement, enduring regular torture while protecting classified information about American carrier operations. His post-war testimony at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal provided crucial evidence for the prosecution of Japanese officers responsible for prisoner abuse. Emperor Hirohito's private reflections on the Doolittle Raid, discovered in imperial archives decades after the war, revealed the profound psychological impact of the attack on Japanese leadership. The Divine Ruler's diary entries from April 1942 showed his growing doubts about military assurances of homeland security. His questions about defensive preparations reflected a fundamental shift from offensive confidence to defensive anxiety that would characterize Japanese strategic thinking for the remainder of the conflict. The raid's influence on post-war American military doctrine extended far beyond strategic bombing theory. The Joint Chiefs of Staff incorporated lessons about inter-service cooperation, intelligence coordination, and psychological warfare into their planning for future conflicts. The successful penetration of heavily defended airspace using unconventional tactics became a model for special operations planning during the Cold War period. Dr. Eugene Patterson, a psychiatrist who interviewed returning American airmen, documented the unique psychological profile of the Doolittle Raiders. These men had volunteered for a mission they knew was essentially suicidal, yet maintained their morale and effectiveness under extreme stress. His research contributed to the development of selection criteria for subsequent special operations units throughout the military. The Chinese Communist Party's official history of the war barely mentioned the American airmen who had been sheltered by communist guerrilla units. Political considerations during the Cold War made acknowledgement of American assistance problematic for the new regime. However, local oral histories preserved stories of the cooperation between American airmen and Chinese resistance fighters, creating an underground narrative that contradicted official political positions. General Matsumura spent his final years in obscurity, working as a clerk in a Tokyo insurance office. The man who had commanded homeland defenses during the most shocking enemy attack in Japanese history never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences. His silence reflected the broader difficulty that Japanese military leaders faced in reconciling their pre-war confidence with the reality of total defeat. The technological intelligence gathered from captured American equipment had provided Japanese engineers with insights into advanced aviation technology, but their industrial limitations prevented effective implementation. The gap between American and Japanese manufacturing capabilities, first revealed during the analysis of downed B-25 bombers, would only widen as the war progressed. The technological disparity that the raid had exposed became a critical factor in Japan's ultimate defeat. Colonel Mitchell's post-war career included assignments with the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, where his expertise in deep penetration operations proved valuable during the early years of the Cold War. His understanding of psychological warfare, gained from observing the impact of the Tokyo bombing on enemy morale, influenced American intelligence operations in Korea and Southeast Asia. The international legal implications of the Doolittle Raid established important precedents for the conduct of strategic bombing campaigns. The precision targeting of military and industrial facilities while avoiding deliberate attacks on civilian populations provided a model for the application of international humanitarian law during wartime. These precedents would influence rules of engagement for military operations throughout the remainder of the 20th century. Flight Sergeant Robert Taylor's post-war struggles with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder highlighted the psychological cost of combat operations. His difficulty readjusting to civilian life, combined with recurring nightmares about his escape through occupied China, reflected broader challenges faced by combat veterans returning from the Pacific Theater. His experiences contributed to early research into combat stress reactions and veteran rehabilitation programs. The Chinese Communist Party's official history of the war barely mentioned the American airmen who had been sheltered by communist guerrilla units. Political considerations during the Cold War made acknowledgement of American assistance problematic for the new regime. However, local oral histories preserved stories of the cooperation between American airmen and Chinese resistance fighters, creating an underground narrative that contradicted official political positions. General Matsumora spent his final years in obscurity, working as a clerk in a Tokyo insurance office. The man who had commanded homeland defenses during the most shocking enemy attack in Japanese history never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences. His silence reflected the broader difficulty that Japanese military leaders faced in reconciling their pre-war confidence with the reality of total defeat. The technological intelligence gathered from captured American equipment had provided Japanese engineers with insights into advanced aviation technology, but their industrial limitations prevented effective implementation. The gap between American and Japanese manufacturing capabilities, first revealed during the analysis of downed B-25 bombers, would only widen as the war progressed. The technological disparity that the raid had exposed became a critical factor in Japan's ultimate defeat. Colonel Mitchell's post-war career included assignments with the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, where his expertise in deep penetration operations proved valuable during the early years of the Cold War. His understanding of psychological warfare, gained from observing the impact of the Tokyo bombing on enemy morale, influenced American intelligence operations in Korea and Southeast Asia. The international legal implications of the Doolittle Raid established important precedents for the conduct of strategic bombing campaigns. The precision targeting of military and industrial facilities, while avoiding deliberate attacks on civilian populations, provided a model for the application of international humanitarian law during wartime. These precedents would influence rules of engagement for military operations throughout the remainder of the 20th century. Flight Sergeant Robert Taylor's post-war struggles with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder highlighted the psychological cost of combat operations. His difficulty readjusting to civilian life, combined with recurring nightmares about his escape through occupied China, reflected broader challenges faced by combat veterans returning from the Pacific Theater. His experiences contributed to early research into combat stress reactions and veteran rehabilitation programs. The memorial services held for Chinese civilians killed in Japanese retaliation became annual reminders of the complex moral calculus of wartime decision-making. American veterans of the raid struggled with the knowledge that their successful mission had triggered massive reprisals against innocent people who had tried to help them. This burden of unintended consequences became a defining element of their post-war psychological experience. As the 20th century drew to a close, historians began to reassess the true impact of the Doolittle Raid on the Pacific War's outcome. Beyond its immediate psychological and strategic effects, the mission had demonstrated the vulnerability of island nations to air attack, foreshadowing the decisive role that strategic bombing would play in modern warfare. The 18 minutes over Tokyo had introduced a new paradigm of conflict that would shape military planning for decades to come. The final reunion of Doolittle Raiders in 2013 brought together the last surviving members of the 80-man crew. These elderly veterans, now in their 90s, shared communion from a bottle of cognac that had been reserved for this moment since 1942. Their quiet ceremony honored not only their own courage, but also the thousands of Chinese civilians who had paid the ultimate price for their brief moment of victory over the seemingly invincible Japanese Empire. The impossible mission that began with 16 bombers lifting off from a carrier deck in the stormy Pacific had rippled through history in ways its planners never imagined. The psychological shock of the homeland attack had revealed the fundamental vulnerability that would ultimately destroy the Japanese Empire. In proving that the impossible was possible, 80 American airmen had changed the course of the war and the trajectory.
Story of the modern world. Their legacy lived on, not in the bombs they dropped or the targets they destroyed, but in the demonstration that determined individuals could achieve the impossible when fighting for something greater than themselves. The divine empire had fallen, but the memory of those who dared to challenge it would endure forever.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.